Welcome to Life Class. Life Class is something Vintage does where we take specific important topics and we ask the question, how does the gospel help us navigate that? And this one was a special one. We got to hear from Dr. Josh Chatraw, who's the head of the Center for Public Christianity, as well as New City Fellows, which is a program we partner with at Vintage. And there's some resources to kind of follow up this talk. If you would like to receive emails about Life Class, whether upcoming events or resources after we do a Life Class, you can just email me, eric.spivey@vintagenc.com. I'd love to send you more information. And as always, if you're looking for events coming up at Vintage, you can always go to vintagenc.com and see a list of events there for downtown and all our locations. So here's Josh.
All right, so my plan isn't, my goal tonight isn't to talk for an hour and a half, but to hopefully have some conversation as I go through. And Eric, I'm pretty amazed you got my last name pronounced right. Did you get help on that?
I've heard it before.
Okay. Like I have good friends for like a decade and they still pronounce it wrong. So for you to get it, and I don't even care. So when someone says it correctly, I'm just shocked. Did everybody get a handout? Okay. So what I want to do is give you a theology of work, which is, and to have conversation when you do that in an hour or so is really ambitious. So we'll see how this goes. I want to start off with how our world wires us for work. And if you want to think about this in another way, this is kind of my cultural analysis of work in a late modern age. I want to start off with an illustration. There was a documentary, I don't know, maybe some of you saw it, by Peter Jackson called They Shall Not Grow Old. Did anyone see that? It's about World War I. No documentary fans. Okay. Maybe we'll get to some movies you guys have seen in a second. But see, he's giving I think for me, all too realistic picture of life for the British leading up to World War I. And he has this footage as well as interviews with people from that time and so one of the things that at the very beginning that was striking was he was talking, or the interviewer that they got footage of was talking to these men who were 17 years old at the time of war. So just put yourself, I mean, everyone here looks Thai, maybe you could be 17, but for the most part, you look a lot older. So, but just think, 17-year-old, and they're recounting their sense of duty at the time that led them to sign up to fight in, what we know to be a pretty horrifying, first kind of modern warfare. And one man exemplified the typical attitude that was just repeated over. He said, quote, "I gave every part of my youth to do a job." Over and over again in the documentary, this was the sentiment that was repeated. You do your duty, you serve your country. Now, I think it's hard for us to imagine, it's hard for me to imagine, and I'm going to project onto you for a second, it's hard for most of us to imagine just 100 years later how these men approached their lives, their work, their duty. Their lives were largely defined by their family, their country, their religion. There was this general sense in the documentary, we're all in this together. You're given a job to do, you do it, you play your part. Even if it meant, in this case, going to fight a war you didn't really understand, with a decent chance you weren't coming home. I mean, the name of the documentary is You Shall Not Grow Old. I think this puts things in perspective for us a little bit. When I tell my 13-year-old who's supposed to be coming in here in a few minutes, to do your chores, it doesn't work for her because she's 13 for her to say, in a few years, if you're living in 1914, you might be, your peers might be going in to fight a war, but I think for us, for you in here, maybe you can feel this a little bit more. For most of us, we have a range or you currently have a range of vocational options in front of you that these men never could have dreamed. You have choices, right? And for me, I want to say, and I think probably for all of us, that is a good thing, right? That's a freeing thing. I am glad we're not in 1914 England right now. So I think this is in some sense freeing and a freedom that we can rejoice in and give God thanks for. But it's also, I like to look at the other side of that and suggest to you this evening that maybe you're not as free as you think you are. Now there is this enormous pressure to find your passion, to make your unique mark on the world through your work. It's not good enough just to do your duty, but work has become a kind of form of self-actualization, right? It's really it's a form of our identity. And so as you enter into college, of course, you have this range of options, and everyone's telling you, I taught at Liberty University for 4 years, so Christian University is kind of exciting place, and they tell students, you're awesome, you're going to do awesome things, which sounds encouraging, and I don't want to say in some sense it's not, but I watch students kind of melt under the pressure, right? Right, so I've got to find what I'm going to do for the rest of my life, and it's not good enough simply to do my duty. I have to be awesome. So on one hand, I want to say thank God for this freedom. On the other hand, I think we need to kind of reflect on our late modern culture's kind of what the philosopher Charles Taylor would say is our social imagination, how we spontaneously imagine work to be. In other words, I think there's a functioning kind of secular theology of work at play, and I would suggest that most of us are probably just naturally going to be swimming with culture, right, on that, unless we actually kind of begin to think what's going on here. So it's one thing having to fight in a war that you might die in, but we might say at least they had something to die for. Now we're kind of at a loss in many cases of what we're supposed to be doing. What is our duty? What are we called to? What are we supposed to give our life to? We still seek significance out, but now we assume our careers themselves will give us significance. Work is no longer a duty to simply get on with or a duty to serve the collective community. Work is now the ticket to personal self-actualization. And we just have to say this is I think there's positives, lots of positives to this new freedom, but the downside is there too. And one of the things about it is remarkable because it's pretty much the only time in human history, this is a unique time in human history. And you might just say even, this is a unique time, we're a unique culture, even now. This isn't standard in many parts of the world. But yet it's the kind of air we breathe. So work as a means to self-actualization. This is how we often introduce ourselves, or at least the first question we ask of somebody, what do you do? It's not what family are you of, because we're all transient people. Like if you say, well, I am of the Chatraw clan, you would say, what? We don't, that's not our culture anymore, where we grow up and we know the families, right? And so it's a pretty natural and intuitive question. So we meet somebody, as we met earlier, and my third question was, what do you do? Our job is this kind of sense of identity, but also it becomes this way that you find kind of actualization. Work is also a means of what I'm calling here consumeristic contentment. The good life is imagined in terms of the ability to buy stuff, and work is the means to be able to buy more stuff. I mean, that puts it pretty bluntly, but it's hard for many of us to imagine a world where we can't go get our iPhone, where we can't go live in certain communities, and we can't drive a certain car. Or at least, and if we can't imagine not having those, we sure want to get to a place where we can have those things. And work is the ticket. And I have here, the other one I mentioned is salvific achievement. Work is a means to prove, in the word, to paraphrase Rocky, that I'm not a bum. That to prove myself, to rise up the ranks, to prove that I can do this. So what does this mean for us? Okay, so that's a rough sketch of kind of a secular theology of work. So what does that mean for us? So I think basically, if that's, to use that analogy that I had before, if that's where the culture is swimming as far as work goes, how do people react to that? Okay, let me give you kind of what I think are 3 reactions to that. Number 1 is you go all in. Now there's a theological word for this, and it's called idolatry. And the problem with idolatry isn't just that you're worshiping something other than God, that you find your ultimate significance, you find your source of meaning for something other than God. That is the big problem. But one of the other problems with that is it doesn't work. Okay? So there's this practical edge to it. It just doesn't work. Those in this category approach their job or their schoolwork or even something that they're not getting paid for, but maybe home renovations, with a kind of frantic excitement because work is the ticket to life, achievement, comfort, control, admiration. They buy in. And so this person is typically or often can rise up the ranks and be very successful. Or if they're not, they grow kind of bitter and angry because, well, this is the ticket. This is the ticket to the American dream. This is the ticket to meaning. And I just want to mention that it's pretty easy for Christians to put a spiritual veneer over idolatry and go all in this way, become workaholics, and call it Christian excellence. And it's easy because it's a sin I know a lot about, okay? So from personal experience, I know this is easy. So one of the things is, on this one, is you need to be in communities that calls you on that. Because it can happen pretty easy, and it looks so good on the outside. Okay. But here's the thing, it doesn't work. And I want to give you, here's another, this isn't a documentary, so don't worry. Anyone watch the Apple series, The Morning Show? Okay.
I saw the first few episodes.
It's intense, isn't it? Yeah. So, and it's not, I do this at church and I preach, and I'm always giving these illustrations, and I have to say, this isn't kid-friendly. So this is another one, not a kid-friendly show. So watch, at your discretion. But I think it's a kind of secular analysis of what it feels like to climb the ladder to one of the positions of fame and power in America today, which is the pinnacle of entertainment and media in New York City. Reese Witherspoon plays the upstart woman, Bradley Jackson. And she has these aspirations to change the world. With her tenacious personality and a good bit of luck in the show, all of a sudden she finds herself hosting the morning show on one of the major national television networks in New York City. But Witherspoon herself or Jackson in the series, she's a small town girl from a broken home. So she embodies a kind of rags to riches story that we love to tell as Americans. I think we love rags to riches stories for lots of reasons, and probably some noble reasons, but I'm in this negative bent right now of my talk. So I think one of I'll say this. I think it inspires us to dream of what might happen to us if we work hard enough. Right? It's like, and that's not all bad, of course. So let me rephrase that. That's not all bad. It inspires people to work hard, but the rags to riches stories can also be a kind of, hey, look what you can do if you just work hard enough and you earn it. of course, this kind of meritocracy can also have a downside, right? For the people who haven't maybe, well, what happens with those who don't get there, who don't make it to the top? They just didn't work as hard as you? And doesn't a lot actually have to happen? Is making it to the top have something to do with, providence, for Christians, God's grace, for lots of other things? But I think there's some noble reasons we like rags to riches stories. And I'm not saying, I don't mean to undercut all the feel-good elements to that. But in any case, Bradley has arrived. At least the American kind of culture would see it. She's admired by millions. She spends her days with the rich and famous. She's ready to use her platform to really make a difference. But then reality sets in, and the show goes dark pretty quick. Her own dysfunctional past contributes to her self-destructive patterns of behaviors that will not magically change with her new circumstances. Okay, so here's what I want to plant a flag in your mind. It's not as if we can say, here's spiritual life, here's the patterns in my home, here are the vices that I have, and somehow that's going to be disconnected to what happens in your workplace. As if it's like skill in the workplace and then virtue and spirituality at church or in your family. What the show, and again, I'm reading this through a kind of Christian lens, and because I'm a Christian, but what I'm trying to say is, she carries her own kind of baggage that she hasn't dealt with into her work, and that affects the way she's going to operate. And so it's not just skill, but it's what kind of people we are. In New City Fellows, we spend a lot of time talking about idols. And at first people were kind of saying, well, I thought this was work and faith and culture, but what kind of people are we? If you read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is driving at, what's going on in your heart? He keeps coming back, what's going on in here? You want to be salt in the earth? You want to be a city on the hill? What's going on here in the heart? Okay, so Jackson hasn't dealt with that, and it keeps popping up in the show. I gotta get through this illustration. I'll keep going here. Underneath, but then there's this other factor. Underneath the glitz and the glamour of her new job, she finds herself in a world where no one is satisfied. A world of narcissism and backstabbing. A world that promises Eden, but all of a sudden it appears to be closer to hell on earth. She's absorbed into this type of community that's deified fame and power and money, because they did kind of imagine that is the good life. That is the kind of imminent this world salvation. And yet here's the kicker. Everyone in the show, and I mean just about everyone, including Jackson, is on the verge of either a panic attack or pursuing diversions to hide from their own misery. This is why my friend he's like, we couldn't get through it because of just the darkness and both the kind of misery that everyone seems to be in the show. So on one hand, I want to say there's something unique about our culture, somewhat about our culture today in this regard, in certain manifestations of this. And I think that show, which is just giving a secular take on some of this, is pointing that out. But then again, I also want to say that this isn't, of course, altogether new in our day. And if you've ever read Confessions, and if you haven't read Confessions, you should repent and start tonight with Augustine's Confessions. So Augustine's writing 1,600 years ago, and you can see the same story play out. It's a different flavor, but it's the same story. So here we have, 1,600 years ago, Augustine telling of his own rags to riches story. Augustine grew up in the backwaters of the Roman Empire. He was from Alabama, okay? Now, I'm from Georgia, and I just like to pick on Alabama because we're always 49th in education, and Alabama's 50th. So I don't know where they are now, but that was when I was in high school. So he is from the backwoods of the empire, and yet Augustine's like, he's the smartest kid. And everyone knows, and his parents know Augustine can make it. It's pretty hard to rise up and climb the ladder in the ancient world, but the way you do it is you learn to speak. You learn to be a rhetor. It doesn't matter what you're saying as long as you're eloquent. And so Augustine gets on this fast track, and he kind of, he had helicopter parents, before that was a mass kind of thing. So his parents were helicopter parents, and he absorbed their ambition for himself. And so he rises up the ranks, and he finds himself pretty quickly in Milan, which is like the seat of power. So he's gone from Alabama, the country in Alabama, to New York City, the New York City of the Roman Empire. And he's now, because of his ability to speak, he's asked to kind of represent the empire, and the emperor, excuse me. And he tells the story in Confessions when he's on his way to actually give. He's like this is one of the pinnacle places, kind of like the climactic places in his career. He's on his way, walking with his friends to give a speech to the emperor, excuse me. And this is what he said he felt when he was doing it. My heart was issuing furnace blasts, anxiety over this assignment, and seething with fever of the obsessive thoughts disintegrating me from within as I passed down a street in Milan and noticed a destitute beggar. Now, the beggar, Augustine would recall, was drunk and finding joy at the bottom of a bottle. While Augustine and his friends, who are like, they've made it in Milan, they've made it in the city, and they're walking to give this speech. He's walking to give this speech to the most powerful man in the empire. And yet he says, he looked at the drunk and wished that he was the drunk. Because he said, while the drunk will be sober in the morning, I'll still be miserable. I'll be still drunk in my own delusions with no relief in sight. And so Augustine is saying, now he's writing Confessions as a bishop, but he's saying he was utterly miserable. And at least this drunk had some temporary relief. And so one of the things you see is whether you're looking at Bradley Jackson in our own age and what she represents, or Augustine here 1,600 years ago, there's something about human nature is what I'm getting at. There's something about human nature that says, no, that person's free. That person's free because they've made it. And yet what Augustine would say if he was here today with us is that he knows all too well the kind of miseries when you go and you look for life in work and life in your career. There's this other quote he says shortly after this. He says, my longings sharply prodded me to drag along a load of my own unhappiness that was heaped up higher with the exhaustion of dragging it. So I think, okay, so am I overdoing it? Is Augustine overdoing it? Well, I'm not saying that everyone, I'm not trying to suggest that everyone in Hollywood who's not a Christian or everyone you meet is just completely miserable, okay? So I'm not suggesting that. I am saying I think what we're experiencing, though, is a kind of nagging restlessness or dissatisfaction. Because what often happens is people get to the top and they start looking around and they say, is this it? So sometimes it's this nagging restlessness. And then I'll get to what we kind of do to try to deal with that. Or we have these things like midlife crises. We have quarter life crisis now, as John Mayer says, where we're like, what's going on? What am I doing in my life? And so I'll get to kind of some other ways. So what some people do at this point, when they get to the top and they say, well, this isn't what I thought it was going to be with my work or career, or they just kind of keep on being frustrated with their work and they feel like, okay, I'm never going to get there, they stop caring. And so there's this other side of this that I think one of our responses is to get jaded. You feel like you're just a cog in the wheel of a giant machine. What's the use? As you're going in to teach school, what's the use? Like these kids aren't listening to me. Or I'm a low person on the totem pole, no one's paying attention. I'm at home cleaning the house, I'm changing diapers. There's no hope in finding self-actualization here. What am I doing? And so you basically just do enough to get by. This, I think in one way, this kind of attitude is represented by another character, which is Tyler Durden in the movie Fight Club. He says, we have no great war, no great depression. He's talking about his generation. Our great war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives. We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'll all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't. And we're slowly learning that fact, and we're very, very pissed off. And so there can be this kind of disappointment which leads to cynicism and skepticism and jaded, and really, it's the opposite of workaholism. It's basically giving up. Okay, let me give you another option, and then you can tell me if I'm missing something here. The other option I think that people often take is, well, okay, I see the first two. There's problems with both of that. So the kind of practical option that a lot of people in Raleigh take, this is actually really popular, is a kind of work-life balance, right? Diversify assets. I want to make money, but not too much money, right? I mean, but enough money. Make sure you have some golf, and make sure you have philanthropic outlets, and do some travel. And on one hand, I want to say, work-life balance is good. This is some good practical advice. But we need to be careful here that we're not just going from idolatry, where we worship work, to just now, polytheism, where we worship lots of different gods. And we imagine that somehow we can build kind of webs of significance on our own if we just diversify our options. There was an ancient man who tried to do this. We read about in the book of Ecclesiastes, right? Successful at his work, he had mansions and power and entertainments. He had a diversified portfolio, the teacher in Ecclesiastes, but he says this, I've considered all that my hands have done and the toil I have expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. He couldn't escape the sense of futility minus God. You get to the end of Ecclesiastes. By the way, Ecclesiastes, you got to read the whole thing, okay? You got to read the whole thing, because if you just read parts, you're very confused. But you get to the end of Ecclesiastes, and he says, okay, when God is in his place, things begin to make sense here. And so if you feel like, okay, you were pretty pessimistic with those first two options, I want to say, on this one, that there's, of course, something to work-life balance that I don't want to diminish. But I do want to say here, even here, that you need to be honest with yourself. And this is, again, going to Ecclesiastes, which is a book of wisdom. The book of Ecclesiastes says a wise person, this is chapter 7, a wise person doesn't go to the party, but he goes to the funeral. And what he's getting at there in chapter 7 is he's saying, listen, we have to learn to number our days, and we have to see our life in light of death. And if we're just kind of balancing out the scales, death has this way of saying, okay, there's coming a day where if you're trying to make meaning and significance and identity for yourself, those webs that you've created are going to get pulled away, and you know it. You're going to lose control. As much as you think your career and what you've built is keeping you in control, no, there's a day coming. And I would say, in some sense, the Christian life is about practicing death and practicing giving this control to God until you're ready to die one day. And by the way, secular people are starting to pick up on this. There's a Martin Seligman was one of the forerunners of the power of positive thinking movement. He writes this: many people believe there is no God, and the only purposes in life are those that those people manage to create for themselves. And when they die, they rot. If this is so, why are so many of these same people cheerful? He's saying, in a secular kind of way, he's just wondering, I think, hey, what are we doing? So, I think one of the ways, and this is a path, what Blaise Pascal, a 17th century theologian, would say is that what we do in this third option is really just fill our life with diversions to keep us from thinking about ultimate reality, about transcendence, about our own death. And I want to say, as a Christian and as a Christian teacher, that as Christians we should think about more about death in order to learn how to live well and work well. Let me stop there. Let me stop there for a second, and see maybe there's some pushback, because I know in some of those I was, casting things pretty gloomy, or another option I didn't see, or we're on this issue of learning to die in order to learn to live and work well. Anything that I've raised in these first 30 minutes or so. Yes, sir.
We desperately, want to honor God, and we want to, be active and evangelical and things like that, but we don't know how to do that well in our workplace because it's constantly evolving all the time.
Yeah, involving in what way?
Like, just as I'm a scientist, so I have new projects all the time, new collaborators all the time, and I have so much front end load that I get into these seasons of just slammed. And then on top of it, new family, and I might be in a new place because that's where the soft money is coming from. I have to go and move somewhere else to continue on that.
Yeah.
And then once I finally get some stability and actually get some credit of this guy's an intelligent person, not some crazy, then I have to move on to the next thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big question that I'm probably not going to be able to answer in a very specific way that would be helpful. But I think one of the big, so two things I would just say generally. One is, in order to navigate, so most of the decisions we're having to make in our workplaces aren't spelled out in Scripture. What I mean is, how do I deal with this when they're wanting me to move, or I'm getting overworked here, or how do I manage this? They're wisdom decisions, right? They're issues. Another word for it is prudence. So I grew up in a certain church tradition, and a lot of times it was like, this is the instruction book for life, right? You heard that? And I open it up, and I'm like, well, I've got to figure out, when I'm in high school, who should I ask to prom? Well, I don't know. I mean, I open Genesis, and they're showing up at wells, and what is that? That doesn't really help me. What am I supposed to do with that? And so no one said, okay, actually, what the Bible's doing is making you wise for life, to be able to aim your heart in the right direction and impart wisdom, so that as we face, because work, it's, obviously, don't embezzle money, don't lie. I mean, obviously there's rules for life in the Bible and rules for work, but so much of these types of decisions, we're having to read the times, which is kind of where I've started tonight, and then say, okay, how do we take the Bible, and as a community, be discerning? And I think what's happened in a lot of cases is we haven't done very well as the church to kind of together to come alongside and say, how do we make wise decisions? If this is what I'm facing at work, what does it mean to walk with God in this situation? So I didn't answer your question because I can't in a very specific way, other than to say, I think to put yourself in a community that's going to walk with you through those types of kind of decisions in your particular context, in your particular work. And for me as a teacher and a theologian, not to have like more kind of intimate relation with you, and then to start make suggestions would just be too arrogant and it'd be foolish for me. So anyway, does that make sense a little bit, or?
Yes, I was just kind of hoping that you might have experienced other people who have found it impossible to kind of catch up to a place where they then have like some opportunity to influence.
Yeah, no, I think there are. I mean, there's certain times where people stay in, and a lot of times where I'm working with, there's people in their 20s and their 30s, and we're talking about leadership, and they're looking at each other and like, I'm just grinding it out, man. And I'm like, yeah, but one day, one day, you're likely to be the one who has more social capital, credentials to be able to say, hey, it's not simply something that's a matter with me and you. It's something a matter with the culture. How are we going to change the culture of this business or this entity? But a lot of times, when you're starting off, I mean, you're going to have to go along with how the culture of the place is, or even the larger kind of sector. Now, sometimes you just have to say, I can't do this, and people get out because it's destroying their family. And that's a decision. Again, those are the types of decisions you need community. It's a wisdom decision to make. But I can talk to you more afterwards on that. Yeah.
That last bit was good.
Okay. Thanks. If I keep talking long enough, a lot of times I will stumble on something good. Okay. Okay. Let's go to theology of work now, because I think I've probably given you enough of where I think we are culturally, because I do think that the Bible gives us a different vision from this. Okay. So if we just kind of looked at, here are people responding to the culture, I think this is a theological framework in the next few minutes to help us as we try to live faithfully in our particular vocations and in our cultural context. So let me lay out this. First of all, a theology of work grounded in God and creation. We're made to work in the love of God. Okay, so just for the sake of time, I'm going to give you some kind of big theological categories without doing all the exegesis, just looking at my time. So this is how of course, 1 John 4, God is love. Okay, love is part of is the essence of God. In a way, for instance, we would say, yes, God has wrath. The Bible describes God as God's wrath, but that's a contingent attribute, right? So we would say that God stands against sin, for instance, in a way with a righteous anger because he is love and because he is holy. So another way to put this, in eternity past, God was not angry at sin, right? Because there was no sin, right? So that's not part of the essence of who God is. But that is when you enter in something that's destroying what's good, then God turns against that because of his holiness and his love, as a good God does. And so the very nature of God. So then the question comes, right? Well, how can God be a God of love without something to love? In other words, did God create us because he needed companionship? Of course, no, that's not good theology, right? God didn't create us because he needed something. God doesn't need anything. And yet, this is where the Trinity, the Christian doctrine of the Trinity comes in, that God is three in one and is in a perfect eternal relationship, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So what does this mean? So creation then must be, and this is how theologians reason, creation was this overflow of God, this overflow of God's love. So we have this picture of a God who in his essence is relational, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who created out of love, this kind of pulsating outward. And he creates image bearers, and we see this in Genesis 1:26-27. We see that what I'm trying to say is we get this relationship aspect of who we are as God's image bearers. Now, I want to say image bearers is much more than this part, and we're going to see here work and this relationship tied together. So listen to verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So he creates humans out of his own image. He creates male and female. They're in relationship to one another. And of course, we know in Genesis 1 and 2, God is in relationship with them as, this picture of him walking in the garden with Adam and Eve. And the task is for them to take care of the world, to steward resources. We are quite literally, in Christian theology, we're made to work. But we're made to work in this right relationship to God and right relationship with others. So we're created to obey God and mirror the God who created us to work. So the important thing to see here is, again, at the very beginning, we were this vertical relationship with God. We're made to love God, to know him and love him and receive his love. And then we're created in relationship with others, particularly man and woman. So there's now horizontal, and then we're created with a task to cultivate, to care for. And so these things, when you step and you're not obeying God, as we know this is where the story goes, then it's going to impact relationship with others. It's going to impact the horizontal dimensions as well. So we see this, and let me give some hands and feet on this. What happens is when we say, okay, work becomes an ultimate source of meaning, not God, but work, or you could say when relationship, we're talking about work tonight, but relationship becomes, ultimate meaning, but with other humans. But when work becomes this almost God-like thing, when we worship the created rather than the creator, then what work becomes is a way that we kind of grasp at survival. This is how we survive, by working. And we'll always be looking over our shoulder. We'll always be kind of feeling like something's missing because we're looking for the love that we were created for to come out of work. And so we're these creatures made to love. This is the heart of who we are, to love God, but then we seek it in all the wrong places. And in a place, and in our culture that frames, or in our imagination, gives us this imagination that says work is how you are self-actualized. We go looking for it through our work, and it doesn't work. It begins to hollow out what type of people we are. We experience a kind of deep anxiety because we know that our identity, our happiness, all of that's contingent on, I got to be someone, I got to get this job, and if I have this job, I have this career, I got to keep it. Or this self-righteousness, as I mentioned earlier, because I've achieved and this person hasn't. But right at the beginning, when we see work connected to a kind of expression of divine love rather than self-love, we actually see work can be characterized by a combination of humility and determination. Determination because you have a motivation much stronger than fear. You're deeply loved by your Creator. That's the motivation. Yeah. So it's a difference between telling my kid, son, you're gonna go and play soccer because you got to prove yourself to me. And if you don't, I'm gonna, you got to be somebody, kind of like the Rocky mode, thinking you're a bum and you're always dealing with this inferiority complex as you get older. I've got to prove something here, to saying God's created me and I'm going to go work And I know he sees me as a son who's saying, I love you. And so work becomes this expression of us as the beloved serving our Father, rather than somehow some way for me to prove myself. And it's humility because, as Paul says, what do we have that we haven't received? What gifts do I have? It's all been given to me. Even my talents, my determination itself. My parents instilled that, and it's a gift. So it's rooted in the love of God. We're made to work, number 2, to reflect God. In Genesis 1 and 2, we find a God with his hands in the dust. God is at work. Verse 27 and 28. So God created man in his own image. The image of God he created him. Male and female he created him. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on earth. So one of the fascinating things that's happened in the world of Old Testament scholarship in the last 100 years ago is they've stumbled upon these ancient texts which are actually creation myths from that world. So if you actually look at these texts, for some people it's unsettling. I don't think it should be unsettling at all, because while there's some similarities with the biblical creation story, there's also some vast differences in them. And some of the differences is that the biblical account is not the result of like two dueling cosmic forces in battle with one another. Instead, the creation, right, we have God and he creates. Or you have a divine council. God obviously has created angels, and I think that's an appropriate way to read the opening chapters, that there's this divine council there. But you ultimately have God as supreme and sovereign. And in these other accounts, the physical world was something either disgusting or something that wasn't really so good, something to be escaped out of. But Genesis gives us this picture of a divine artist who forms the world good, good, good. And then in these other creation stories, they offer this explanation about human work. They say humans were created by the gods to do the dirty work the gods wouldn't want to do. And so if you think about this in the ancient world, then it's kind of like, well, there's this kind of desire to escape from work. Okay, so let's let all these people do work, and then the elites, well, we don't. The goal was you don't do work, right? Work wasn't dignified. But then the remarkable contrast in the biblical story is that God is at work. He creates humans in his image, not because work is bad, but because we've already seen God is at work here. And he says now, so work is given this dignity, this value. This is before the fall. This is before sin. There's goodness in work. In Genesis 2, God creates the land and puts the man not only in Eden, but in a garden within Eden. A garden which we're told later God walked in. And later in the story of Israel, we're given this picture of the temple. And if you're a Israelite and you see the temple and you see the creation story and you're reading Hebrew, what you see is you see a picture of Eden as a temple. And the temple, as you guys probably know, the closer you got, the closer you got in the temple to the middle, you got to God's presence. And then we see in Genesis 1 and 2, this kind of, you've got Eden and you've got the garden, and there is God. And then in Genesis 2:15, you have this language. It's translated in the ESV anyway, work it and keep it. That's what we're called to do. And those are the same words in Hebrew that are given to describe the role of the priests in the temple. And so there's a ton of Old Testament scholarship on this, but let me just kind of sum it up. The first humans are presented as image bearers, as royal priests made to mediate God's presence to the world as they worship in God's presence and care for the sacred garden. So there's this connection. Worship, caring for the garden, cultivating, working. They're called to multiply and extend the boundaries of the sacred place. All right? I mean, they were to extend the garden out. They were to discover, right? They were not only assigning names to animals, but they were discovering how the world works. They did this, and in some sense, we have this picture of God as the creator, and now he has these sub-creators who are called to create. This is part of what it means to be the image of God, to order the world, to reflect God in their work, to reflect his love and his justice and his righteousness, and to do this in relationship with one another, and thereby extend God's blessings to the earth. So when God comes in like Romans 12 to Abraham and says, I'm gonna bless the world, like that was already in place in Genesis 1 and 2. It's just that things change when sin entered the world, but the commitment to bless the world is still there. It's there from the very beginning. So see this, work is meant to be a form of worship. We glorify our Maker by how we work. That was built into the whole deal at the very beginning. Finally, real quick, number 3, we're made to work and rest. Of course, we saw God work, but we see God resting. And I think one of the big issues, and I see it in my own life, and I would just encourage you not to let this go when you see it in your own life. When you're not able to rest, when you go on vacation and you can't put your phone down, or you can't stop checking your work email, it's probably some idolatry there. All right? You can't rest. You can't rest, and you can't just be. I think you can't sit in God's presence. You can't pray because you got to hurry to the office. You don't have time. I think that's a sign that works become the source of identity. This source that actually controls you and has the power over you because you can't rest. Yeah, we're called to work, but when we make work our God, work owns us and we can't rest. So rest is a good thing, and we see that built in the creational pattern at the very beginning. Okay, so in light of the fall, I've set this up. Now let me give you kind of, and you guys know the story, and a couple of things. When sin entered the world in Genesis 3, I want to stress, we're still image bearers, right? It's not that structurally now it's not as if like when we fell, we became some kind of different species, right? I mean, we're still made to love God and love others. We're still made to work. And so the way that theologians talk about this is we're still, and this might make some of you nervous. Let me put it this way. Sin affects everything, and it distorts everything, but we're still good structurally as humans. And what I mean by that is this desire to love, that we were made to love, is still a good thing, right? It's still a good thing. We're image bearers still. That we're made in relationship is a good thing. That we're made to work is a good thing. But now we don't love the right things. Our relationships don't go well often, and our work and our ability to cultivate and create and discover and to do this work is now tainted and distorted. So good structurally, but now we might say we're wrongly aimed. Or we're still image bearers, but now our loves are disordered. We don't love in the right order, in the right way. So what happens with the fall? Well, you guys know the story of Genesis 3. Broken fellowship with God, out of the garden. There's death, which includes, you don't get the physical death right away, but you got to get this immediate spiritual death. Broken relationships. The fundamental relationship between man and woman is now a power struggle and is not harmonious. And then, of course, broken vocations, We're called to be fruitful and multiply. And then we're told in Genesis 3 about pain in childbirth. So our calling is to fill the earth, and now we see the distortion of that, the problem that occurs in Genesis 3. Or we're called to cultivate, and now what's hard? Cultivating. We have to, by the sweat of our brow. So you see this doctrine of sin now that's holistic and reaches all of what we're supposed to do as human beings. And so here's my question. We can talk through this for a second. So don't just leave me hanging up here. Let's talk through it a second. If that's right, and that's the right reading, and we have this holistic understanding of the fall, how does that impact how we think about redemption?
Well, it should realign our loves.
Yeah.
It's not per se like a reset or a reboot. It's that, a realignment of back to what was supposed to have always been.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's not, so the gospel actually impacts all of those things, right? So if you grow up with a kind of theology that says something like this, we're created here and the world is really bad, and you might imagine the world to be like a sinking ship with all these people on it, and our job is as Christians is to get people on the lifeboat, right? Because the ship itself is sinking and is going to be destroyed. So if that's kind of the theology, this kind of lifeboat theology, then it's just like, what's our job here? Tell people about Jesus. Okay? And what's the point of Jesus? What's the point of the gospel? But what we're saying here is totally people are at risk of drowning. But my question is, first of all, that ship itself is good. It's broken, but it's good. But then, what are we being saved to? What does it mean to be an image bearer, and what does the gospel save us to? And what I would, and this is for two ways the gospel is good news for our work, and I'm not going to give you the exegesis of these passages because I want there to be time for Q&A and time to talk. But what I would want to suggest is when we're redeemed, the gospel puts us in right vertical relationship with God, right? And that begins to change who we are, and it changes our relationships with each other, and it's going to impact how we go about cultivating and discovering and unfurling. It's going to change our heart, which means it changes our motivations, but it also changes the way we're going to actually put others before ourselves. It's going to change the way we look at our work, and it's going to give us this bigger picture that our work can fit in. Another way to put this, and I'll use the language I have here, is through the gospel we find our true identity to live out our true vocation. Our vocation is to be this image bearer, to be someone who reflects God. We've seen God as a God who creates, who's at work. We reflect God by doing work in a way and in a manner that ultimately honors Him. But we do our work not looking for an identity, but because we've already been redeemed and called sons and daughters. And that's what Romans 8:12 gets us, okay? Because it's saying, for we're all led by the Spirit of God and are sons of God. This is the famous passage on adoption. So we're called in, and we're called sons, and we're adopted. And there's this whole biblical theology of sonship that I don't have time for. But what it's going to is it's saying Adam's a son, and yet Adam failed. And then, of course, the language you get with Israel, Israel's called to be a son. And in being a son, they were to reflect God. So, for instance, when you get in the New Testament and Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, so they would be called sons of God. He's not talking about like genetics there, right? He's talking about in a world, in a pre-industrial world, sons did what their fathers did, right? And most of us don't have this experience, right? I mean, my dad was a fighter pilot, so he didn't expect me to be a fighter pilot. But again, those 200 years ago, and for most of civilization, you did what your dad did. So when Jesus comes and he's talking to the Pharisees and he says to them, your dad's the devil. It has nothing to do with genetics, obviously, right? He's saying, you're acting like your father. And he's saying, in other words, because you're reflecting them. And so at the very beginning, he's saying, Adam is a son. You're supposed to reflect the Father. You're supposed to reflect God. Israel, you're a son. You're supposed to reflect me to the nations and how you live out. And of course, that was holistic for them, right? Pretty detailed how they were to do this, but they failed. And then the king was to be the son, that at least the king and King David and those after him would reflect him. And over again, there's this calling to reflect God in the leadership, and it fails. And then you got Jesus, and he comes, and he's the faithful son, who perfectly reflects the Father to the world, who saves us from our sin, puts us in right relationship with God, and now we're adopted as sons and daughters of the King. And what's our job? To reflect the King. So now this is important. In our work, we're not bringing in the kingdom, but in our work is to serve as a kind of preview for the kingdom. So sadly, me and my son have only gone to one movie theater in the last 2 years. But my son's favorite part is, one of his favorite parts of the movies are the previews, right? And the previews are supposed to get you excited about going to see that movie and give an accurate depiction of what that movie is going to be about. And that's our role in our work, is to give this preview, and in our lives, to give this preview of the coming King. We're not ushering it in. God brings in his kingdom, but we're saying God cares about justice. And so our work should reflect justice. God cares about righteousness. God cares about loving our neighbors, so we're going to reflect that. This is what he's getting at when he says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be sons of God. In other words, sons of God are peacemakers because God's a peacemaker. So this is our call, this is our identity. We're sons and daughters, and then it gives us this vocation in the world. And then through this, last point, and then we can talk if we have time. Through the gospel, we become gritty visionaries of hope. So in this passage, it talks about this kind of, even creation itself is this groaning and longing for renewal. That creation itself, the boat, to go back to my metaphor, is going to be redeemed. Creation itself is going to be restored. New creation, new heavens and new earth. That's the picture we get in Revelation 21. But through this, there's this kind of difficulty now that's present throughout the New Testament. And so it doesn't let us get away with this kind of idea that everything's going to be easy while we do this. And so we have this vision of the new creation, that the new creation in some small ways has already, in some significant ways, have broken in through Jesus and his ministry, and now through the Spirit and the church. And yet we still live in this world where, yes, we're new creatures, as Paul says, but we're new creatures who still struggle with sin, who still have these bodies that die. And so what Paul's giving us in the New Testament is giving us is the resources to be these kind of what I would describe as gritty visionaries. In our work today, whether it's in our work, if we're striving for justice, if we're striving, even if it's in a workplace that's, it's not a nonprofit, it's not like justice is what we're pursuing, but even if you're striving for justice in that and fairness within that workplace, right, in the systems, what we're going to find here are lots of reasons to give up, right? Because we live in a world where if we're imagining some kind of utopia in the here and now, like you're going to be pretty jaded pretty quick if you're actually striving to reflect God. But what we're given here is some of the, I think, resources to continue on. Because work is meaningful, because it's this calling by God, and yet we have this vision of what God will finally do. So it's not what theologians call over-realized eschatology, where we're saying, okay, we're going to do this, and we're going to usher in the kingdom, and we expect this here and now. But it still says, yeah, but Jesus broke into the world, and the Spirit's at work, and things, and he's working to preview what's finally going to come, and to be a part of that has a great significance. And that can happen whether when you begin. What I'm suggesting is we need to begin as a community to have bigger imaginations about what we're doing. Because if we adopt this secular imagination that I started with, then what we're going to do is we're going to go along and say either I'm going to be able to bring injustice on my own, and very quickly you're not going to have the resources to sustain that, and you'll just quit and become jaded. Or I'm going to make a lot of money and that's going to satisfy me, and you're going to be disappointed. But this vision is a vision of really what I would say is hope. It's a vision of hope. And it's a vision of saying, look, in the first century, no one expected Jesus to change the world, right? I mean, Jesus was like crucified on a cross. No, that is not what great kings do. A bunch of fishermen, this is not the kingdom. And yet, what we see how is even in that, especially there, climactically there, in the cross, in his death, he turned the world upside down. And so, with the assurance that we live with this assurance that when we strive for justice, when we live out our lives in small ways, whether it's faithfulness in parenting, whether it's, not telling that joke at work, whether it's trying to create systems in your workplace that are just, you're doing something that in the end God's ultimately going to take and actually use as part of his kingdom. And so there's significance in that. There's hope in that. And there's not even a small thing. There's even the smallest thing has value. So one of the things we have to do in the community, and I think I'll end here, is as a community of Christians, we have to be exercising our imaginations together. And if we buy into where I started with, that where work is just self-actualization, the path to the good life, I think basically we're taking a secular theology and we're just putting Christian veneer kind of over it. But if we actually go in and see the storyline of Scripture, then what happens is where our hearts are aimed becomes different. And then as a community, we can begin to discern what's the Spirit doing, what's our calling, how do we work this out? And I think that's the task of the church, right? The Bible doesn't give us instructions for how to work all this out in a 21st century market capitalist society. But what the Bible does give us, it gives us a change in posture. It equips us with wisdom, and now it's our church's, it's our community's job to use discernment and wisdom to navigate, the world that we live in. So that was a lot. I'm going to take questions or verbal abuse or comments, whatever you guys want to do. I can get real practical on stuff, or I can talk theology, whatever you guys want to do for the last few minutes we have. Yeah. Well, we'll go Calvin. Is it Calvin? And then we'll go here. Yes, sir.
So a little bit of just practical,
Mhm.
theological. So picture how landed what I think I would say pre-2015 would have been one of my dream jobs. And now Just would like to just hear some thoughts on that of like, A, not staying jaded, but as well as how not to, in a way of like, I have to admit, like, there was some idolatry out of like, oh, things are getting crazy. Oh crap, I think I put way too much weight on, me landing this job, and so just wanted to sort of vague, but like maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, so I had a friend who a year or two ago was in a job and he was thinking about leaving, and we started talking about it, and it was pretty clear he was good at it and he was making an impact. But he had this like little niggle that, I don't know, it's not fully, it's like maybe I should go into ministry, and the contentment wasn't there, and well, the Anglicans have this wonderful tradition that they have these discernment groups. And it was like 4 or 5 men who knew him well, and we met 4 or 5 times, and we heard his heart, we prayed for him, and then we asked the Lord to help us, with wisdom to speak into his life. And I just think that's like a lovely thing that we should create more for our jobs as we're trying to wrestle through this. I say one of the things that came out of that though was, one of the things I said to my friend was, I think you're trying to get too much at it. Like, you're good at what you do, and you're making an impact. You're the leader. People look up to you. I know you're a Christian witness in how you act and what you're saying. I just think you're trying to get too much out of work. In other words, I think there was some functioning. He's good theologically, but there's some functioning over-realized eschatology about what work was going to provide for him. And so it's like he had to devalue work in order to I think, find a kind of, to find more contentment, because I think his expectations were too high. But I said that with like fear and trembling, right? So it wasn't like, thus saith the Lord. It was more of like, I wonder, okay? And so I think some of its expectations, there's got to be times so I'm a theological realist in the way that, and what I mean by that is, the world's going to be messy. And this kind of retreat to saying, the world's messy, so let's like kind of go away in our corners where it's not so messy, and work's going to be messy and it's going to be hard. And I think, so I'm in this work and faith movement of something I do, and one of the challenges there is sometimes that they have a doctrine of work, creation in God, where my first major kind of theology, but they don't do enough with the fall, right? Like sometimes it's going to suck. And then I think our time is to look at resources to say, okay, what resources do we have here to be these kind of gritty visionaries and stay in? And we got to do this together. We don't need to be kind of isolated, because so much of our spirituality in the evangelical world has been dualistic, right? Bible study, prayer, worship songs, work over here, and they don't meet. And so kind of like what I do most of my days is thinking through, how does this impact this? So I think so sometimes the advice is, you got to go, man. You got to go. Like, this is not healthy for you. It's not healthy for your family. Why are you staying here? Other times it's like, no, you need to stay. You need to stay. You can't run from this. You got to stay. And so, but those again are discernment types of things. And if you're not in a kind of community that's wrestling with this, and who know you and can speak into your life and speak into this situation, that's what that's what you need. That's what you got to have, because there's no like, you're not just going to turn to the Bible and find a passage that just solves the question of how do you deal with that boss who's a jerk. Like it, yeah, like, well, I need to love my enemies, but okay, you got to work that out in community. Yep.
Yeah, I'm curious in your thoughts or how you've seen COVID affect the 3 reactions. So
Oh yeah.
people like trying to agree more often and reordering their values, or like maybe not so much. Like,
Well, the biggest thing I've seen, and I'd be interested in what you guys have seen, because you guys are, but what I've seen Well, it's different because I spend my time in the fellows program with 20 people. We're working this out together. And so they have automatically like a space to work these things out. But what I'm seeing more largely is a lot of despair. I mean, the mental health stuff going on right now is, it's hard to get an appointment with counselors and psychologists right now because we're, so Blaise Pascal again, he says 17th century, he's reacting to movement in the modern world where basically people are, especially in his class of kind of French elite, they're growing more skeptical, and so they're looking for like the pleasures of life, what you could call imminent contentment in this world. And he says, but what they're actually doing is filling their life with diversions so they don't have to think about kind of big questions. And so a lot of his apologetic, because he was an apologist as well, was to kind of help them realize that those are diversions that are actually making them miserable. I think what we're getting at today is people are kind of knowing they're anxious and miserable and they don't know what to do. And so I don't think it's so much one. I think it's more the second one. And they're trying to go to work-life balance. That's pretty hard to do when like you're working from home or just the kind of state of where things are. There hasn't been a ton of balance and for a lot of people because everything there's no buffers, in your day anymore if you're working from home. So, and then the other thing Pascal said, because he's great at analysis of the human heart. Pascal talks about how one of the things that we can't do is sit in our room alone. And so we're not very good at that, and we're going to try to escape that by any means possible through these diversions. But in some ways, like, it's been hard to do for a lot of people. And so I think there's a real opportunity evangelistically here, obviously, but I also see a lot of hurt and pain. And I think it's in part because some of the crutches that we've used to divert our attention have gone away. And I think in the human heart, we're made for something so much more. And that was Pascal's analysis. He's the famous one that says the heart has reasons that reason knows nothing of. And so we've got this built into our heart, and yet when work and all these things are dead ends that we thought we could find significance and identity from become more dead ends or frustrating, we begin to despair. And I think that's ultimately some spiritual going on there that as Christians we need to step into. But we also need to recognize it in our own life because it's not as if like culture's out there and then we've got it all figured out as Christians. It's like, yeah, I don't care what you say. Functionally, our theology is oftentimes more that first part of my talk than actually what the Bible teaches. Sorry, this is a long answer. Let me give you one more thing though. So the problem here is that so much of our education, even if we talk about it, has been, let me pour data in your mind and let me give you this, kind of like what I just did, give you this theology of work. Oh, then now that solves it. Actually, it probably hasn't solved much for you, right? You just like, oh, okay, I see how that fits. So the next step has to be, how do you get this story? How do you get this theology in your bloodstream? And that's going to happen through practices and habits, as well as through hearing the word preached, Bible intake, but it's going to be more of kind of what stories become dominant in your life. And I think we get that in us through the church, through the rhythms and patterns of making sacred space in your day, praying. The things, though, that our modern world is bucking up against and saying, no, you got to hurry up and get to work. And so we've got to learn to be these countercultural communities that live by another story, because we're not going to do it independently, because it's got to get in our bloodstream. So I just don't think right now a lot of the way we're doing Christian education, it tends to be brain rather than holistically. I'm all for brain. Like, I realize, dude, that's all important, but I also know that I can I can read the right things and still functionally live off that secular script most of my days. And I'm like, do this for a living. So for you guys on the front lines, like, we're in this together, but we got to have more. We got to have more community. We got to have more gospel. We got to have our habits in our life need to change to get it into the bloodstream. I think. Okay, so we'll go here, yeah, and then Pat, yeah.
When I think about like doing justice and cultivating something, it seems really obvious in terms of like blue collar work. Like say I'm changing the oil on a car, like make sure I tighten everything to right pounds per pressure and change the washer, like things that like could easily go unnoticed, but like
Yeah.
Can really make like a difference. Whereas like white collar work, like I'm working in an Excel sheet like all day, like it doesn't seem too obvious to me, like what cultivating something looks like. It just feels like blue collar work has like that more satisfaction element to it, and it seems like our culture is very much shifting more and more towards this white collar service industry.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Have you heard of Enron? I mean, as the antithesis. I think it depends on the industry and the sector, and this is what has to be worked out in community. And this is where I mean, like, you're not going to get, a final chapter in the Bible that says this is how you work yourself in the tech industry. But I think number one, institutions are made up of people, and institutions have patterns that are often unjust within the institution, because you got sinful people and you've got collectively sinful people create patterns and habits in institutions that have problems. And so I think no matter what company you are, you're going to have it impacted by sin. And so you're looking for, one of the things we train people is say, okay, how do you put on this gospel story lens and say, what are the gods of my industry? What are the false gods? And then where are the places that are broken, and what are the places that need healing? And I think in almost every industry, when we have people do this, especially by the time they've kind of worked out some of this theology, I mean, they have plenty of things to say. Now, can you do that when you're maybe, starting off? No, but you can't necessarily fix all that, especially starting off. But you can be aware of them so that you're not cultivated by those gods, informed by those gods. What are the things that people are, who are the figures in your world that everyone looks up to, and why do they look up for them? That's one way to get going there. But then there's also a recognition that, hey, if the Lord ever were to give me the ability to change some of the structures or manage the way I'm going to treat people, the way I'm going to fix some of these things, I see them already, and I see some ways that we might be able to fix them. So if I'm given that opportunity, I would want to be a part of that. So I mean, that again, this has to be worked out discipline by discipline. Some things are going to be more obvious than if you're, what does it look like to change your practices if you're plumbing? Well, I mean, treat people fairly, these things, but you're going to still change the pipes the same way, whether you're a Christian or an atheist, right? It's not, the actual technical work there is going to be what it is. Another quote, yes.
So my question is, how would you respond to someone who is a mother or father of three who has to work 3 or 4 jobs, who thinks that it is difficult to make progression, and really the idea of work is to settle contracts on the outside.
Settle
Contracts, for instance, I have rent to pay.
Pay bills, yeah. Yeah.
I have, all of this stuff
Yeah.
that must get done. And really the only way to get it done is to work.
In the sense, if I can maybe make that a little bit more sharper, like it's almost like I don't have the luxury to theologize about this. I just got to pay bills, right? All right. I'm putting a little bit more force on that. Yeah, I would say that as we're working that can be, I would say a couple things. One, that can be a pretty, like, especially in our society today, that can be, or maybe any society, but I think especially the society that says you should be getting all these things from work, and then you're like, I'm just trying to pay bills. One thing, there can be this out of worry. Jesus talks about worry. You begin to worry, and you know, you're gonna. Money can be a god of the rich and the poor. Okay, and I know that's like, but if there's this anxiousness and you say it's all up to me, and you feel the burden, I think Christianity gives us resources that says, I mean, Jesus is like, hey, don't worry about what you're going to eat and drink. Don't worry about how you're going to be clothed. I don't think he's saying, we know from Proverbs, right? We need to do a biblical theology. Proverbs says, you better work. Okay, he's not saying don't work, but he's saying, what are you really trusting in? What's really your hope in? And that gives you a different posture. It gives you resources to hope. I mean, to be honest, you know, the people in those situations tend to go, and they look to religion, in particular Christianity, for hope. It's the affluent people who think, well, I'm in control, I can get this done. But if you talk to somebody in that boat, and you show up and you're Richard Dawkins and say, there's probably not a God, so don't worry about it and just live a good life. You're like, if there's not a God. All right, I mean, that's not good news for the person you're describing. So the person you're describing often is a lot more open to divine intervention and a kind of enchantment for their life. And I think for Christianity gives you that story of reality that provides resources for hope. And I would say, look, they're not under the illusion that their work is going to somehow satisfy them. And so I'm not saying that I want anyone to be in that position, but there's a reason that Jesus came in and said, beware. He was really pointed to the rich, because they have the tendency to think, I don't need God. And it's the poor who know their dependency. So I think there's a lot of really good resources, but I'd also say for those who are who do have more opportunities, we're also commanded in the New Testament to care for those who are working for the 4 jobs. So it's the job of the Christian community to say, what are we going to do to help you with your work? What are we going to do? But we're not going to do that if our focus, if you're not in that situation and your focus is on rising to the top, and it's like, I gotta squeeze out all the contentment and joy out of this job as I possibly can because it's my God, then you're not going to help those who have to work 4 jobs. It's not going to be on your radar screen. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say. And if I'm that person, I'm wanting that person to theologize about their work. Because if they're not theologizing, they're just going with the culture and they're not going to help, right? And for that person, I think theology gives some real resources, but they don't need to be a theologian. They just, trust in God and believe His promises. So. Sorry, that was a long answer. Yeah.
That was perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
Before we go, if you have any resources, books, podcasts, anything for folks who want to keep learning more,
Yeah.
and specifically this topic, anything off the top of your head?
Yeah. So we have forums through the center. We have the fellowship program. I'd love to talk to you more about it. It's more of a deep dive, but it's also just a really, I think, a beautiful place to do Christian community. So it's not as if you're like, oh, I just have to read a lot. No, you're kind of, one of the things that people are surprised about, I think, 2 things is the spiritual vitality of the program and the friendships they make. So I would just encourage you to consider that. As far as resources, there's a lot. If you want to think about some of the restlessness that we're experiencing in our kind of cultural moment, there's this book that says, Why Are We Restless? By Story and Story. It's a husband and wife team at Furman. And they're getting at this question. That's a little bit more kind of academic, but I think I was drawing from it a little bit at the beginning. If you want a primer on these issues of work and faith, Tim Keller's book, Every Good Endeavor, written with Catherine Alsdorf, who helped start the center, is a really good book, Every Good Endeavor. And it's a similar theology that they're tracing through. I think to get to my point of one more book, it's one I read recently by, I'll just give you the title, because Richard Beck is the author, and the book is called Hunting Magic Ills. And it's getting at this point about how we attend to the world. And it can't just be believe this theology of work, or believe God, or believe that God's involved in the world and in my work. But it's not primarily about work, but it's how we live in a disenchanted age and how we learn to attend to the world differently. That's Hunting Magic Ills, and then Every Good Endeavor and Why Are We Restless by Story and Story. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks.
Thanks so much for watching our life class recording. Again, for resources following our life class events, you can always email me, eric.spivey@vintagenc.com. And for information about upcoming events, life class and otherwise, you can go to vintagenc.com/downtown. Thanks so much.